Okay, folks, welcome today. Thanks for joining us in person, and thanks to those of you who are joining us online for this event on multilateralism and LGBT plus human rights, opportunities for queer diplomacy. So my name is Corinne Lennox. I'm Senior Lecturer in Human Rights here at the School of Advanced Study. I'm based in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which is one of the hosts for today, and I have a bit of information on the table about what we do here. The event falls within our aims to promote human rights and democratic institutions, and amongst our areas of work is decriminalization of various human rights issues, from poverty, but also as an example today on protection of LGBT human rights across the globe. And we also work generally on supporting rule of law. But we know that when it comes to the human rights of LGBT people, that in many countries, the law is actually used as a tool of persecution of basic human rights. And in 64 countries, there continues to be criminalization of private same-sex consensual sexual activity. All of those criminalize men, and 40 of them criminalize also women. And of the 64 countries, 29 are in Commonwealth jurisdictions. And although there has been progress in recent years on that, and certainly in the years that I've been working on the issue, we've also seen, of course, regressive measures. And I've taken that data from the Human Dignity Trust, which works on strategic litigation and other legal processes to support LGBT people to achieve equality before the law. But we know that the courts are not the only means or space to protect the human rights of LGBT people. And today we have the opportunity to discuss the role of international diplomacy. And in this regard, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Douglas Janoff, our speaker today, to share with us findings from his research on this question, as featured in his book entitled Queer Diplomacy, Homophobia, International Relations, and LGBT Human Rights, which is published by Macmillan in 2022. It's the first study of multilateral LGBT human rights diplomacy viewed from the perspective of its practitioners, so diplomats, LGBT activists, human rights experts, and multilateral specialists. So let me just say a little bit more about Dr. Janoff. He was appointed to Canada's Foreign Service in 2009. He is presently a senior Foreign Service officer at Canada's Foreign Ministry, which is Global Affairs Canada. He's a seasoned human rights negotiator. His career has included diplomatic postings in Washington, in Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And before working in diplomacy, he was a freelance journalist, community activist, policy advisor, university instructor, and investigator of human rights violations in prisons and the military. Come in. Welcome. Among his other publications is his book entitled Pink Blood, Homophobic Violence in Canada, published by University of Toronto Press. It has also been translated into French. And the book Queer Diplomacy is discussing today is based on his PhD thesis, and I'm sure he will tell us a bit more about his research process today, but no doubt it's been pursued in the vein of the activist scholar tradition. I should stress that he is speaking today in his personal capacity, not as representative of the Canadian government or Global Affairs Canada. We are also recording this session, as is the convention here. We'll record Doug's presentation, but we will stop the recording for the Q&A so we can have a freer discussion from that. So with that, I'd like to invite Doug to present to us some of the findings from his research. We'll have about a half an hour from Doug, and then we're going to open up to questions. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And
you ready to PowerPoint?
Yes, sure. Why not? Yeah, so really, I just wanted to thank Dr. Lennox as well as the Institute for Commonwealth Studies and the School for Advanced Study for inviting me to come and talk to you all. It's good to see people in person. It's also great to see people online and connect that way as well. So, and I just click.
Should be, yeah, or you can use these.
Oh.
I better use that. The forward one, yeah.
All right. So I'm going to just start with, can this?
Yeah, I can just speed that up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so what is queer diplomacy? I would say, we could basically talk about how after World War II, with the, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was this movement to really promote Western liberal values and democratic institutions, universal human rights, through multilateral institutions and processes that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and I wanted to start focusing in more on what was happening after 2010. So that was really when we started to see a much more visibility of LGBTQ rights appearing in international processes. So, the turning point from the point of view of a researcher, and sometimes you sort of take an arbitrary moment, historical moment. For me, it was December 2011 when Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, went to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and said, gay rights are human rights. And, that just shook everything up. She wasn't the first person to have said it, but I would argue that, someone in that position of responsibility with that kind of profile in an international institution, it really really allowed a shift to occur. There was a shift that happened, and there was no going back at that point. What is it? I mean, LGBT human rights diplomacy it promotes LGBTQ rights through various bilateral, multilateral initiatives, but it also generates conflicts with countries that do not necessarily support LGBTQ rights. So the way that I studied it, there are many ways into this topic, but the way I did it was I sort of created this model where to kind of get my mind around this of you have three sides of the triangle, which we'll look at, So my research question was, how do diplomats both promote LGBTQ rights globally, and how do other diplomats try to undercut, subvert those rights, and where are those links? So when you look at
Oh, that's a bit weird. Okay, and I'll just highlight down here. Yeah, there you go.
Right. So this is my neat little diagram. So you have LGBTQ organizations, you've got the diplomats, and you have the intergovernmental organizations, and they all have their own very unique relationships with each other. And in multilateral diplomacy, you always have, when it comes to human rights, you have civil society organizations that are trying to lobby like-minded diplomats to support certain human rights initiatives. And you also have organizations that are working with the intergovernmental organizations to ensure that those spaces are created for that type of work. So I'm going to skip over the overview and get right into it. So I broke it down, the presentation, into theoretical research and sort of the policy implications. And so just to kind of get our minds around the type of theory needed to engage in order to understand what's going on here, I basically looked at three main areas. So the first area is really the critical scholarship on the emergence and growth of LGBTQ identities and equality-seeking movements. So going back to the late 19th century, how did those social movements emerge through the period of demonization, stigmatization, criminalization, gay liberation, into sort of the equality seeking movements that emerged from the AIDS crisis, and sort of looking at those ways that the LGBTQ community came together, first around a more fixed gay and lesbian identity, and then how the critiques from the queer, the trans, the post-colonial critiques, there was a fragmentation of identities that kind of emerged from that process, which is ongoing today. And it's really important to understand these different identity categories, both Western and non-Western, when you start talking about like what is LGBTQ rights and what is it that diplomats from the West are promoting abroad, because you realize that it can mean different things to different people. So there is that, identity theories of identities, which I really think is very crucial. Like, I was really fortunate because I worked in an interdisciplinary program that really encouraged me to blend. So what I was trying to do is take, the more sociological theories of social movements and identities, and then somehow merge that with the more familiar mainstream international relations theories, which is sort of the second piece. It's really the core concepts of mainstream scholarship on international relations, diplomacy, multilateralism, human rights, looking at how these constructs of sexual and gender identity have sort of permeated the global LGBT or global human rights discourse in a lot of these institutions, like the UN Human Rights System, the Universal Periodic Review, how that has emerged, kind of looking at how these traditional frameworks within international relations dealing with development, human security have tended to exclude LGBTQ populations in the discourse, the critiques on that and international development. And then, and international human rights law, very interesting, looking at the treaties, looking at how, queer subjects are excluded from, they're invisible in many ways. Trans people are invisible, lesbians are invisible in women's, a lot of women's documentation. So I think it's really important to have a grounding on that, to kind of look at where the gaps are. And then there's now this third, more sort of emerging critical literature that's really trying to interrogate where the conflicts are coming from. So you basically, what's happening is there's the global politics of how state homophobia is, emerging in a lot of non-Western countries, and how that has an impact on the domestic politics in other countries. And we see that in the news. I was looking at the Chechnya example in 2017, when there was a campaign against a horrible campaign that incarcerated and tortured primarily gay men at first, and then 2 years later there was a campaign against lesbians and trans people as well. So how do individual countries weaponize religion, nationalism? How do they make these links to colonialism, to Western influences that are impacting these countries, the leader of Chechnya famously said in an interview, when he was confronted about the fact that all these gay men were being arrested and tortured, he first of all, he said there were no gay people in Chechnya. And then he said, but if there are, send them to Canada, please. So there's that, there's always that tension between West and East, and the idea that what these people are doing in their own country is foreign. It doesn't belong to that country. So how are nationalisms, religions, and identities, local identities, weaponized against LGBTQ people? So that's a whole fascinating area. I think I'll go from there to the next question, which is about how I did this research. So looking at the methodologies, there are a lot of challenges to doing this type of research. And so what I did was, I went to Geneva, New York, and I attended UN human rights meetings. I did participant observation. I did interviews with 29 human rights advocates, diplomats, UN officials, and experts, and they told me about what they do to try and promote LGBTQ rights on the global stage, and how other diplomats in those types of forums try to block their progress, how they oppose each other, the sort of the tricks and techniques of multilateral diplomacy, which was quite fascinating. Also, from a personal point of view, it was fascinating. I used a multi-dimensional standpoint epistemology. So using my own positionality as a researcher, a diplomat, white, cisgender, gay man from Canada, those were all areas that, gave me some privilege in the research process, but also in some ways held me back and prevented me from seeing the whole picture. I think what I learned in this process was that it's going to be impossible to get the whole picture, and you don't really have to, but you have to kind of acknowledge that you didn't get the full picture, and you have to point out where those gaps are. And hopefully somebody else with a different perspective is going to be able to, maybe shine a light on another aspect of the research project. So, in my case, it was unique because and we'll look at that process. But I came out during the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and so my activism was very much informed by that through sort of the emerging LGBTQ activism, journalism. And so I was like really into anti-violence activism, that sort of thing. And then at a later stage in my career, I went into government, and through a very interesting series of twists and turns, I ended up working as a Foreign Service officer in our diplomatic, so I was appointed to the Foreign Service, and at age 52 went on my first posting. So I'm not your typical Foreign Service officer who's going to graduate at age 25, write the Foreign Service exam, and become a typical Foreign Service officer. Like, I've always been someone who's really been very inquisitive and but it allowed me to study this and to write about this from a very unique perspective. So this is sort of a taste of where I was coming from. That's me as an undergraduate at McGill in 1981 at a International Women's Day March, and that was my that was what I felt comfortable in. And then I had no idea. I actually failed the Foreign Service exam as an undergraduate and thought I would never become a diplomat. And then 30 years later, life can sometimes be funny. And then so 30 years later, and this was when I was younger, we marched the International March on UN and Lesbian and Gay Freedom in 1984. So I had no idea at that point, what this whole process was going to become, and that this would be discussed. We were marching to the UN saying, hey, let us in, we didn't realize that we were going to get in there. And so there I am, 30 years later, with my suit and tie, and I'm at the UN headquarters. This time, I'm doing research for my PhD, which I was working on part-time while working full-time as a diplomat. So I'm at the UN headquarters, I'm interviewing people. And then I went to Geneva. There I am on the top of the WHO office. They have a great cafeteria there. And it was just a really, being at the site of the League of Nations, it was just a very interesting moment for me to be there and to realize that these LGBTQ rights that I had worked on as a young man, that I, marched for, were now being discussed at very serious locations where, international treaties and human rights negotiations had taken place. So, on a personal level, it was a very validating experience for me. This is in the Palais des Nations, where if you ever get a chance to go to Geneva and take a tour of the Palais des Nations, this is the grand hall where the Human Rights Council has their meetings. It's a very I don't know, you've been there, you know what it's like.
Yeah,
It's quite an impressive space. Yeah.
Especially the ceiling.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and there's quite the ceiling too. I mean, those are 30-foot windows. And so, I went to one of the meetings. This was a meeting that was discussing human rights and business. And so I went and asked a question about LGBTQ participation in the workforce and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So it just kind of gives you a flavor for the types of meetings that were out there. They have a great library there. So I had my library card and I could go all around. It was very exciting. It was like, I really, that was my research nerd time, for sure. So I'll tell you a little bit about the research and, what what came out of that. I sort of broke it down very roughly into 3 areas. And, one area is going back to that little diagram of the triadic nature of human rights diplomacy. So looking at, the strengths and weaknesses of multilateral human rights diplomacy and how the UN system works. There was a lot of people complaining about the Universal Periodic Review because, you make all these recommendations for each country, but then there's little follow-up, and how can these countries be accountable if, they're being told the same thing, 5 years later, and so forth. There was this in the conversation, one of the mentalities that came out was really about, us against them, and they're the bad, the Western diplomats were all, like, they hate us and they don't understand universal human rights and they're out to get us, and we're the ones who know everything. And they're just standing in our way, like it kind of surprised me how, dehumanizing some of the language was that people would use. They would say, the Africans don't want us to do this, the Islamic states, and they are doing this to us, the Asians are doing this, the Latin Americans are doing that. And it kind of surprised me because you sort of think of diplomats as being these, very cool, polite people. But I mean, again, getting into the, where I was wearing those hats, so when I was doing the research, if I was talking to a diplomat, I had my tie on, and that person would talk to me, relating to me like a diplomat. If I was, talking to a queer activist, I would be in a very different setting, or if I was talking to a UN person or an expert. So I felt like I got many different angles of the discussion. From the diplomats, there was really, like, I guess, a lot of sense of the polarization, the voting blocks, the enmity. With the activists, there was a lot of hope. There was also, they talked about a lot of the dangers that people from countries that are more authoritarian or police states or that criminalize LGBTQ, like they didn't feel safe talking in those international forums. Yeah, I mean, how to promote LGBTQ rights bilaterally and multilaterally through my interviews. I could see many different techniques. I could see how this human rights discourse was percolating through the institutions. It starts as a UN human rights system process, but then it gets adopted to the development process, through the women's area, through. So it was interesting to see these different agencies and pillars within the multilateral system that were being challenged by questions around sexual orientation, gender identity. I worked on a case study looking at the 2014 SOGI resolution, and interviewed people to talk, who really explained like how you make a win, like who you have to ally yourself with, and where those challenges are. There was a lot of discussion about how winning a resolution like that really is like something that you can brag about, you can take home, you can use that to apply for funding as an NGO, that sort of thing. And then the final thing that I just wanted to touch on are the policy implications that come from my research there. I mean, there were lots of examples that you see in the final chapter about, certain practices and techniques in multilateral human rights diplomacy that can enhance LGBTQ rights. It raises questions, like, especially who benefits from this type of very high level diplomacy. I mean, when you bring in people from other countries and they're there and everyone is arguing about, if you have to say gender expression as opposed to gender identity in a resolution, that can create hours or days of negotiations. but then the question is like, how does that impact people on the ground in those countries that are affected? Do those NGOs really, should they be devoting that much in terms of resources to these types of processes as opposed to directly supporting survivors, people that are in prison, people that are being victimized? So I don't have answers to those questions, but I was trying to kind of collect the questions that were emerging from this type of research. There was a lot of, the sort of a larger question is, in these multilateral processes, like so many, you get this objectifying discourse that Dorothy Smith, the Canadian sociologist, talks about, where the victims, the subjects disappear, like we forget that we're talking about victims of discrimination and violence in many places, and how do we humanize and remind ourselves of why we're doing this kind of work. And so I guess that's kind of sort of leaves a lot of the civil society organizations vulnerable as well. And very often they are completely dependent on Western donors for their work, and yet they're working in non-Western countries. They're being accused of promoting a Western vision of sexual orientation, gender identity. How do you do that? How do you assert your non-Western bona fides while still having to be dependent on funding from a multiplicity of sources? That's something that's very difficult to answer as well. A lot of talk about, I talk to a lot of diplomats. I talk to queer diplomats, that are facing discrimination, doing this type of work, or queer diplomats that from countries where they are criminalizing LGBTQ rights. That was that could have been a thesis in itself. Like, how do you do that? If you're a queer diplomat and you have to go to the UN and oppose LGBTQ rights, how do you do that? And what does that? Or what if you're from a different identity category, where there's a lot of contradictions that emerge from the support of LGBTQ rights? And so I use one example of, like, a lot of Latin American countries are now embracing LGBTQ rights, but they also criminalize women's reproductive rights in their countries. So what does it mean to go to an international forum and say, yes, we support LGBT rights, but in our own country, we are criminalizing women for having abortions, for example? And so does that mean that supporting LGBT rights is like, why are they doing that? Is that because it's a Western thing? Is that because is it a cisgendered thing? Is it, are there gender implications to supporting one thing and not supporting something else? So again, didn't have any answers to a lot of those questions. And I'm just throwing out, and then sort of leave you with sort of the two key themes. One is, the portrayal of LGBTQ rights as a barometer of Western civilizational superiority. Violations against LGBT rights are held up as a marker of a backward, barbaric society. So this is, it's not just about, LGBTQ rights. It's really more than that, and then that opposition, based on the claim that LGBTQ rights are proxy for a broader imposition of Western values. And so really kind of looking at that clash. So that's kind of my research in a nutshell, and interested in any questions you have that came out of that.